There's a B-2 pilot whose identity is so closely guarded that even the generals don't name her publicly. But in June of 2025, she flew the longest stealth bomber mission in nearly 25 years, penetrating Iranian airspace to cripple 3 nuclear facilities. The mission was so classified that her own family didn't know where she was for over 30 hours. She is one of only 10 women who have ever qualified to fly the $2.2 billion B-2 Spirit, a jet so complex the cockpit had to be redesigned just to accommodate a female pilot. 2 decades ago, it was impossible to imagine a woman in that seat, and now she's executing the most sensitive strike missions on the planet. So who is she? What does it take to join the most exclusive pilot cadre in history? And what happens when the world's most advanced bomber is handed to someone the system was never built for? The B-2 Spirit is the most expensive aircraft ever built, a flying wing designed to slip past air defense networks undetected. Its pilots are handpicked from the top 1% of Air Force aviators. For 2 decades, that cockpit was exclusively male, not by policy, but by precedent. Then a single woman shattered that barrier, and recently, another proved it was no accident when she helped execute Operation Midnight Hammer. This is the story of how a handful of women fought their way into the most exclusive flying club on Earth, and what their presence means for the future of aerial warfare. To understand why that first female pilot was such a shock to the system, you have to understand what the B-2 actually demands. This is not a fighter jet you strap into for a 45-minute sortie. The Spirit is a flying wing with no tail, no visible engine intakes, and a radar cross-section the size of a golf ball. It carries up to 40,000 pounds of conventional or nuclear ordnance, and it can stay airborne for more than 44 hours in a single mission. The cockpit is tight, 2 ejection seats side by side, and the mental load is relentless. A B-2 pilot simultaneously manages flight controls, a communication suite that stays connected to global command networks, and a weapons package sophisticated enough to strike multiple targets with GPS-guided precision, all while sitting inches from another human being for what can stretch into 2 days. The Air Force screens candidates ruthlessly. Beyond top-secret compartmented clearance, they test spatial disorientation tolerance, cognitive endurance, and stress resilience under sleep deprivation. Only the top fraction of 1% of rated pilots even qualify for an interview. For the first 13 years of the B-2's operational life, every single one of those pilots was a man. Not because of a written rule, but because the pipeline from undergraduate pilot training through bomber qualification drew almost exclusively from a male-dominated pool. And the specific physiological and psychological demands seemed to filter out the rest. Then in February of 2002, Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Avery climbed into the left seat and broke the barrier entirely. She had already made history as the first female B-1 Lancer pilot to fly combat sorties over Kosovo in 1999. She had not campaigned for the B-2 slot. She put her name forward on a whim, curious whether she could meet the standard. When she passed, the Air Force had to scramble to modify the cockpit, installing a privacy curtain around the tiny toilet because the 2-person crew space had never been designed with a woman in mind. That detail alone tells you how unexpected she was. Over the next 2 decades, only a handful followed her. By 2019, just 10 women had earned their Spirit numbers out of over 500 pilots total. The obstacle was not capability, it was perception. In a force that recruits from itself, mentors sponsor candidates who look like them, and women did not look like the faces already in the cockpit. Yet somehow, a small cohort persisted. They passed the same check rides, pulled the same alert shifts, flew the same endless orbits over Iraq and Afghanistan. By the summer of 2025, they were no longer novelties. They were fully integrated into the most sensitive mission on the planet. When the order came for Operation Midnight Hammer, the coordinated strike against Iran's underground nuclear facilities, the mission planners did not select pilots based on gender. They selected based on who could execute a 30-plus hour flight through contested airspace, coordinate with submarine-launched cruise missiles, and strike hardened targets without detection. A woman flew one of those B-2s. The Pentagon has refused to release her name. With so few female stealth bomber pilots, revealing her identity could compromise operational security or make her a target for foreign intelligence. That silence is striking. 2 decades after the first woman proved it could be done, the Air Force now considers her successors so valuable that it conceals their very existence. But that secrecy also hides a deeper story. What happens when the most exclusive combat unit in history opens its doors to women? And why, after all these years, are there still so few? The answer to that question is more uncomfortable than most people want to admit. The B-2 was never just a military boys' club by tradition. It was a weapon system physically designed around a male body. When Jennifer Avery first stepped into the cockpit, the crew compartment had no accommodations for a woman because nobody had ever imagined one would be there. The toilet, a small chemical unit tucked behind a thin panel, required a privacy curtain retrofit that the Air Force scrambled to engineer only after she qualified. Think about that. A $2.2 billion aircraft, the most advanced stealth platform on the planet, and it took until 2002 to install a curtain because the idea of a woman flying it was that remote. That detail is a symbol, but it is also a warning. If the hardware itself was built with such a narrow assumption about who would operate it, then the software of the culture. The assumptions about capability, trust, and belonging ran far deeper. Avery herself has said she didn't set out to be a trailblazer. She applied because she was curious whether she could meet the standard. She passed. And when she flew her first combat sortie over Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, she became the only woman ever to fly the B-2 in war. She held that solitary distinction for more than 2 decades. Yet she later reflected that the biggest barrier wasn't the physical demands or the mental endurance, it was perception. She believed other women didn't apply because they felt they would not be accepted. The numbers proved her right. In the early years, the selection process funneled candidates from a fighter and bomber community that was overwhelmingly male. The few women who made it through undergraduate pilot training often self-selected out of the bomber track, steered toward roles where they believed they'd face less resistance. The result was a pipeline so narrow that by 2019, only 10 women had ever earned the right to wear the B-2 patch. 10 out of more than 500 spirit numbers. That is not a glass ceiling. That is a locked safe with a combination nobody had thought to share. And yet the mission did not pause for culture to catch up. B-2 pilots fly missions that can stretch to 44 consecutive hours. They operate from a cockpit with no windows to the outside world, reliant entirely on sensors and instruments, navigating across oceans, penetrating the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, and delivering precision strikes against targets buried deep underground. The margin for error is zero. The physical and cognitive toll is unlike anything in aviation. For decades, the Air Force selected for a very specific profile, people who could endure that grind without breaking. That profile, by default, was male. Not because women couldn't do it, but because the selection system was built on a self-replicating loop. Male mentors groomed male proteges who looked, talked, and performed like them. Breaking that cycle required someone to not only meet the standard, but also survive the invisible friction that came with being an outsider in a sealed capsule for a day and a half. Jennifer Avery did that. Then a handful of others followed, each one quietly validating that the standard had nothing to do with gender. Then came June of 2025. Operation Midnight Hammer. The coordinated strike against Iran's fortified nuclear sites required B-2s to fly deeper into contested territory than any stealth bomber had done in decades. The mission was planned in extreme secrecy, executed at night, and timed precisely to coincide with submarine-launched cruise missile salvos. The pilots selected for the strike were not chosen as symbols. They were chosen because they were the best. One of them was a woman. When General Kristen Goodwin was asked about her, she said simply, she was put on there because she was qualified and she was ready to execute that mission, just like the guys were. No other reason. The Pentagon has refused to release her name. With so few female B-2 pilots in existence, revealing her identity could make her a target for foreign intelligence or domestic harassment. That silence is both a mark of how far women have come and how fragile that progress remains. 2 decades after the barrier was shattered, a female pilot may fly the most critical combat mission of the decade. And the military cannot publicly celebrate her because doing so would expose just how lonely she still is in that cockpit. Yet something else shifted that year. Major Jennifer Crum became the first pilot ever to fly the B-2 while pregnant. That milestone forced the Air Force to rewrite flight medicine policies that had never accounted for a pregnant pilot in a stealth bomber. Just as they once retrofitted a privacy curtain, they now had to retrofit decades of assumptions about physiology and performance. Each of these moments, the curtain, the pregnancy waiver, the unnamed pilot over Iran, reveals a pattern. The B-2 did not welcome women. It was forced to adapt to them, one quiet revolution at a time. And that pattern raises a more urgent question. As the Air Force looks toward the next generation of stealth platforms, the B-21 Raider, will it design the cockpit and the culture around the full range of human talent from the start? Or will the next female pilot have to tear down the same walls all over again? The answer, if you look closely, is already written in the silence that surrounds her. The decision to conceal the identity of the female B-2 pilot on Operation Midnight Hammer was officially about operational security. With so few women in the cockpit, naming her would be like putting a spotlight on a single soldier in a crowd. And that alone is the indictment. After more than 2 decades of women flying the B-2, after combat missions over Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Iran, there are still so few that to acknowledge one is to risk exposing her to every adversary intelligence service on the planet. That is not representation. That is a small, elite handful carrying an entire gender's worth of visibility on their backs, and the Air Force knows it. So, it hides them. Not out of shame, but out of a quiet, unspoken fear that the breakthrough everyone celebrated was never really institutionalized. It was a series of exceptions, not a new rule. Jennifer Avery said it herself. The biggest obstacle is not the jet, not the hours, not the cognitive load. It is the perception that women will not be accepted. That perception, it turns out, is not just a feeling. It is a measurable force that shapes application rates, mentorship paths, and retention. The proof is in the numbers. By 2025, the B-2 community had minted over 500 pilots. Fewer than 15 were women. That ratio is not a pipe problem. It is a door that opens just wide enough to let a few through and then quietly presses shut again. And the pattern repeats everywhere the stakes are highest. While those B-2s were penetrating Iranian airspace, guided missile submarines were launching cruise missiles from the Arabian Sea. On board at least one of those subs was a female officer, part of a community that only opened to women in 2010. She too was unnamed. She too was executing one of the most sensitive operations of the decade, and like the B-2 pilot, her anonymity was not just about security. It was a signal that even in moments of victory, the systems that put them there still do not know how to talk about them without making them targets. That is the deeper escalation. It is not about one jet, one squadron, or one branch of service. It is about the entire architecture of strategic deterrence. The most classified, most lethal, most politically sensitive missions on the planet are now being flown and fought by women, and the institutions that train them are still running on procedures written for a single gender workforce. When Major Jennifer Crum became the first pilot to fly the B-2 while pregnant, she was not breaking a rule. There was no rule. The Air Force had simply never contemplated the scenario. Flight surgeons had to write a waiver in real time. That is what happens when a system designs for one type of human and reality delivers another. You retrofit, you patch, you hide, and then you congratulate yourself for progress while the fundamental machinery stays the same. So the question is not whether the next generation of stealth platforms will be designed for the full range of human talent. The question is whether the people who build them are even capable of imagining that range. Because until they can, every female pilot who climbs into that cockpit is doing more than flying a bomber. She is testing whether the institution that put her there will finally stop treating her existence as a security risk. And for now, the answer is no. The institution still treats their existence as a security risk because, in the airtight logic of classification, a woman in a B-2 cockpit remains an anomaly, and anomalies attract attention. So the Pentagon hides her face, not to deny her credit, but because the very fact of her presence remains so rare that it is operationally sensitive. That is the brutal circular irony. She flew the longest B-2 combat mission since the opening days of the War on Terror. She crossed Iranian airspace. She delivered the payload that helped dismantle nuclear bunkers, and she did it flawlessly. The proof of her competence is written in the cratering of underground centrifuges, and yet the Air Force cannot say her name aloud without feeling like it is handing an adversary a targeting dossier. That is what it means to be the system's exception rather than its expectation. Jennifer Avery understood this better than anyone. She never wanted to be a symbol. She was a pilot who happened to be a woman, not a woman pilot, and yet she spent her career functioning as both. She flew the B-1 in combat, then the B-2, and then she and her husband John made a little-known piece of history of their own. They were the first married couple to both fly the Spirit, their careers running in parallel for 20 years. Married pilots are prohibited from crewing the same aircraft, so they could never be in the cockpit together, but they shared the same squadron, the same mission, the same silent weight of operating a nuclear-capable stealth bomber. On September 7th, 2018, they retired side by side in a joint ceremony at Whiteman Air Force Base. It was not a headline. It was a quiet footnote. A husband and wife team who had lived the entire arc of the B-2's operational life, and in that moment, the barrier that once required a privacy curtain felt, at least for one family, fully normalized. But the woman who flew Midnight Hammer is not Jennifer Avery. She is the next generation, the one who inherited a cracked open door and walked through it without permission. Without fanfare, armed only with qualifications that matched or exceeded every man in the briefing room. Her anonymity, however painful, is also a mirror. It shows exactly how far the culture has come and exactly how far it still has to go. Now the gaze shifts forward. The B-21 Raider is in production, the next stealth bomber that will eventually replace the B-2. For the first time, human factors engineers are designing that cockpit with the full spectrum of human bodies in mind from day one. That is the quiet, unglamorous victory that the unnamed pilot has already secured for those who follow. She is proving, mission by mission, that the standard was never about anatomy. It was about imagination. And the Air Force, slowly, is learning to imagine bigger. That shift doesn't announce itself with a press release. It happens in the anonymous cockpit of a bomber that nobody sees leave and nobody sees return. It happens in the flight surgeon's office when a waiver is written for something that was never considered. It happens in the quiet retirement ceremony of a husband and wife who spent 20 years proving that the only qualification that matters is the ability to execute when the world's most expensive aircraft is in your hands and a hostile nation is beneath your wings. The B-2 was designed to be invisible to radar. Its pilots were never supposed to be invisible to history. The woman who flew Midnight Hammer will one day have her name known, not because she demanded recognition, but because the institution will finally grow comfortable enough to give it. Until then, the legacy she builds is written in the shift from retrofitting privacy curtains to designing cockpits for every body from the start. That is the real payload. If you want to see how the B-21 Raider will reshape the future of strategic strike, make sure you're subscribed. The next chapter is already taxiing.